Hi everyone, welcome back. You are listening to What's Going On, a podcast where we have important, relevant, and sometimes difficult conversations to inspire you to start having your own. In today's episode, we are talking about the transgender experience in lieu of the Transgender Day of Remembrance. As we learn from our guest speakers today, who has graciously offered to put in the emotional effort required to educate us on the oppression trans folks face, I'd like for us to acknowledge the harm the colonial perspective of gender binaries has inflicted and continue to inflict upon folks who identify beyond that dichotomy, even if they're accepted in their own local communities. These trans folks, the community in India, the spirit community among indigenous folks. What's going on is Suffolk University's Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion in Boston, Massachusetts. Hence, we would like to honor the Mashpee Wapanoa, Akina Wapanoa, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts tribal nations whom this land originally belonged. It is imperative to acknowledge the Massachusetts tribe, who historically lived in areas that make up present-day Greater Boston. It has come time for us to think about the appropriation we have inflicted upon the indigenous community, people whose land was forcefully taken away and culture nearly eradicated. We honor the diverse tribes, people, and respect the connection to this land. To know more about the land you're on and ways you can support the indigenous community, please visit www.native-land.ca, and for those of us in Massachusetts, maindigenousagenda.org. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce our guest speakers today, Kim and Cam.
Thanks, Xin Yi.
She introduced you first, so you get to.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Kim Nguyen, and I use they/them pronouns. Is there anything else?
Who are you?
What do you mean? Who am I? Oh my gosh, I had to do like a whole 1 minute. I'm Kim Nguyen. I use they/them pronouns. I currently work for a nonprofit in Boston, Massachusetts, doing healthcare advocacy. But prior to my experience there, I've been a community organizer and I've worked on a lot of campaigns. So, and specifically progressive movement campaigns. So, yeah, I feel like that's it.
See, look, you do so much cool stuff. It's important to talk about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for gassing me up.
I'm Cam, also they/them pronouns, Cam Breither. I am the assistant director for the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion at Suffolk. So I'm mostly just like the professional queer person, and I get to do a lot of really fun work with students on campus. Prior to coming to Suffolk, I worked at UMass Amherst and then the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and University of Michigan doing intersectionally focused LGBTQ plus work mostly, and working around things such as educational disparities and racism, xenophobia, specific in how it intersects with queer identities.
You are so much more prepared with your intro. I was just like, I thought I was going to do like name and pronouns, and then suddenly you're like, explain your professional background, but good job.
Yeah, Cam must have done this for so many times that they have like this template, just like and that's all. So before we go deeper into the actual episode, just a content warning for those out there. We'll be talking about violence against trans folks, and Kim and Cam will be recounting some personal experience that may remind you of your own trials and tribulations. So everyone, please take care of your mental health. Take a break if you need, and come back and join us. So with that, let's dive in. So November 20th is the Trans Day of Remembrance. Can the both of you give the audience who maybe the first time they're hearing this or do not actually know what is it for, can you give like an overview of maybe the origins and what do people normally do on that day?
Sure. You want me to take the beginning of this one? Okay. So Trans Day of Remembrance is something that actually was founded. I had to look this up because I thought it was 1996. It's actually 1998. So it was founded by a woman named Gwendolyn, a trans woman named Gwendolyn, to remember her friend Rita Hester, who was actually a trans woman of color who was murdered in actually Alston, which is something I actually only found out a couple of years ago. And I think the concept of TDoR is something that we're actually kind of more familiar with now because we have the Black Lives Matter movement as kind of an additional framework where we're Right. There's also within the Black Lives Matter movement, there's the hashtag of say her name or say their names. And this is essentially a 90s precursor to that. We know that trans folks don't get spoken about a lot, especially when we're talking about the 90s. Like, I started transitioning in the 2000s and didn't really know that trans people existed until the early 2010s. Right. And I was always doing queer activism since high school. So Trans Day of Remembrance came around to give mostly the trans community space to remember our siblings who were either taken from us by anti-trans violence, or who lost their lives in other ways the first couple of years. But then afterwards, because it's such an epidemic of violence against specifically trans women, and specifically trans women of color, and specifically Black trans women, that it really became a celebration of the lives of folks who were stolen from us.
And I think, like, for the trans community, it's so important to observe this day just because of lack of visibility, especially for trans women of color. I think, because trans women of color suffer through so much anti-trans violence, that oftentimes their deaths just become another statistic. And so, the practice that Cam was saying that, also Black Lives Matter is doing around saying their names is about, honoring these people, and making sure that people know about these people, that is not just a statistic of another, trans person getting murdered, frankly, or, their lives taken in other ways. So I think that's why, it's an important day for the community to observe.
And normally when folks are observing it, it's usually through memorials. This year, Trans Resistance Massachusetts, formerly also sometimes kind of also known as Trans Resistance for Black Lives, if you go on Twitter and find them there, are going to be doing a rally and march. I believe they're going to be gathering in person in Forest Hills, but we're actually going to be streaming the coverage of the rally on the CSDI social media on Sunday. So I think it starts at 6 or 7. But a really great organization. So that's kind of one of the ways that folks usually will gather around this, is taking time for reflection, but also trying to figure out how we as a trans community can get together and collectively do actions to try to protect ourselves and our siblings.
I think, having been with CSDI, with Center for the Inclusion for short, for a couple of years, I witnessed the fight for equity, especially amongst trans folks, from gender inclusive bathrooms to just being able to walk outside and feel safe. And you mentioned about the Black Lives Matter movement, and also violence against trans folks, especially transgender women of color. Would you mind talking more about that, and also possibly kind of give the audience an overview of, or an idea of, just how serious this issue is?
I'm going to give this one to you because you're the one who knows the health outcomes of things.
Oh man, okay. I could talk for this for hours, so please interrupt me if you want more specificity. I mean, in terms of the violence that is faced by trans women of color, I mean, I don't want to pull like the oppression Olympics card, but I feel like in this case, like, I can wholeheartedly say that trans women of color face the worst disparities in health, in almost everything, and face the most violence when you talk about marginalized communities. And that's genuinely by design. So I can go more into like health outcomes and visibility, but what I really want to focus on is the fact that like trans women of color are largely the reason why queer folk have any rights at all. But yet trans women of color are still the most marginalized, even within the queer community. And that is by design. I can go on about this for hours, but, I personally think it's about, how we build movements and what we view as palatable. And like, unfortunately, I think the progressive movement, up until now, while we've made some really great gains, we've also done it on the backs of people, and then haven't given them that same liberation and giving them that same, kudos that they deserve. And then that has, a horrible effect on their lives, because ultimately, if your community is also the community that is shunning you, putting you in the back, then of course your life outcomes are not going to be what they're supposed to be. And what I'm really talking about, is even in the fight for marriage equality, which was something that was really big for the queer community. But in the fight for marriage, we really tried to, well, not we, but like the royal we, I believe, really try to create like a palatable version of queerness for cis straight people to understand. And so it became Love is Love.
Homonormativity, yay.
It became Love is Love. And while that is great and grand, and I'm definitely happy that there is marriage equality for the queer community now, if you think about priorities, right? Like folks that are most marginalized in the LGBTQ community, marriage is so far away on their list of priorities. Like when you are getting denied access to healthcare, when your doctor won't see you because you're trans, when you can't get a job because you're a queer person and there isn't non-discrimination laws in your state, when you get denied housing because there's nothing around housing discrimination, when you don't get the basic tools to be able to fill your life and to be able to, live your life, how are you going to think about marriage, right? And so like, and then that leads to, how pride is now very corporate and is very tailored towards a version of queerness that is palatable to people, and I guess understandable. And so I think in kind of taking it all back, trans women of color, although did the most work for, the queer community, and for a lot of liberation in general, progressive movement building in general, are still the ones that are the most stigmatized in our community.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about that later into the session where you talk about transgender women of color and also intersectionality, right? Both your queer identity and also your ethnicity. And I want to talk more about that later in this session. But I think when you're talking about marriage equality, it's interesting because when we talk about marriage equality, we often think a lot about gay folks. We rarely think about non-binary / transgender people when we talk about marriage equality. And I think it's an interesting thing to reflect upon, right? When we first, at least for me, when I first got to know about LGBTQ plus communities, it's very, even then, it's very narrow. It's almost all about being gay and being out there. And where's the rest of the alphabet in that way, and so confronting that upbringing of binary, not just binary, but also boxes and categories, I think it's something worth thinking about. And so going back to you talking about how transgender women of color are often the ones who kind of basically bring in gaming terms, carrying the queer community to where we are today, and yet still are continuing being oppressed and discriminated. Would you say then that within the queer community itself, there's like a lot of disagreements, and in that way, like infighting in that sense? Is that like, do you think
you froze for a second?
So I'm not sure if you were done.
I'm sorry.
No,
so my question was, so do you think that's, other than the discrimination and oppression for queer folks overall, do you think part of the reason why trans women of color still faces so much oppression, do you think it's because of the so-called like infighting or like the intersectionality within queer community itself?
I mean, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think trans misogyny is also like a special kind of evil.
Yeah. Especially to like trans misogynoir. But right, so when we, Cindy, you know this is a DPE, but right, like when we talk about oppression, we know that a strategy of things like colonization, a strategy of white supremacy, is to encourage those who are oppressed to continue to perpetuate the oppressions, whether it's on themselves, using things like internalized racism or internalized homophobia as a concept, or whether it is putting into the heads of queer people that you cannot have a race if you have a sexual orientation that is not straight, right? Like there are, in my previous positions when I've worked in just LGBT resource centers, I had students of color come in who were like, I don't feel like I can be Black in this space, but I can be gay here. And then when I go to, our African-American center, I can be Black, but I can't be gay there. And I think the queer community specifically has a big issue around race, because racism doesn't go away just because you're a gay cis white guy. We know that cis white men have a problem with racism already. We can see that, and we know that cis white ladies do too. All white people do, because have you looked at the election results still? White people are still the problem, right? So we know that there is a race problem in this country. We know that there is a race problem specifically with white people, and that the way that we talk and learn about race is just totally bonkers. And then when you add things like sexual orientation onto that, and you give us an acronym that, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, plus, and we have our queer alphabet soup, we then kind of have this idea that, because we're in a community together, we're all going to be nice to one another. And my racism is just going to dissolve away because you're queer too, and that's fine. And sadly, we know that the systems of oppression in place don't allow that to happen. So we have this really neat game where people who are oppressed just continue to oppress people around them. So you have, white cis gay men who Kim kind of alluded to, right? Like actively working towards things like marriage equality, doing things that we know are really self-serving, and then actively excluding like trans people from that narrative, and actively excluding Black people from that narrative. And if they're actively excluding trans people overall and Black people overall, then we know that trans Black people are going to get doubly excluded too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think in particular, the United States is ruled by like a couple of like big systems, right? It's like white supremacy, colonialism, and like the patriarchy. And I think this comes out in the same way in the queer community as it does in any community, in that we're still ruled by those systems, right? So like that's where you get, trans misogyny, because it's still about trying to uphold the patriarchy. Where you get, when you get transphobia, it's clear has roots of white supremacy and colonialism. And so, you get people, like Cam said, trying to have proximity to privilege. And in the queer community, your proximity to privilege is being the most cis and the most white that you can be, so that maybe the only thing that is different about you is that you happen to be gay, or you happen to, that you happen to be gay. So then you get folks on Grindr, right, that are cis white men putting like no fats, no femmes, no Asians on there.
No spice, no rice.
No spice, no rice, like all of this stuff, right? And that's not even talking, right? And like we haven't really addressed like trans women of color, but you can see how it trickles down, right? Is that, if you have people saying these things, it makes sense that, that trans women of color would be the most oppressed in the community. So I don't even know if it's necessarily infighting. Like, I don't think that it's like, that we're just like fighting against each other. I do think that it is a fight to be closest to privilege. And to distance yourself so that you can move through the world in a way that gives you more opportunities.
Yeah. And I think based on that proximity to privilege, there are times where there are infighting, and the most infighting I've ever seen is people trying to dismantle the acronym. I know a lot of people who say, well, the T shouldn't be in LGBT because that's gender identity, not sexual orientation. So we should separate the gender from the sexual orientation because they don't have anything to do with one another. Pardon me. And really that's just a way to try to offload, less desirable, less like cis and heteronormative individuals like trans folk, non-binary people, genderqueer people, because as Kim, very eloquently put it, right? We have all these additional systems that are just at play. And if I want to push away the folks who are more oppressed than me, who don't have the same kind of privilege, of course, I'm going to then advocate to drop them from the whole acronym together. Because I know the gays and lesbians can get as close to privilege as possible because they just happen to be gay. But these trans folk, I don't know what they're doing then, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same stuff to take this a little bit away from like queerness, when like, let's just talk about race and like maybe the election. Like, it's the same stuff that happened. Like, I'm Vietnamese, right? So like my community in this election, a lot of folks were Trump supporters. And that's not because, I mean, I think it's, we can talk for another podcast about, the model minority and like all of that. But again, it's another like proximity to privilege. It's, internalized, whatever it is, right? If you're talking about race, then it's like internalized whiteness. If you're talking about queerness, it's internalized homophobia. Like, it's the same couple of systems that I think are ruling a lot of what's happening in the United States right now.
Yeah. And I think Ryan put a good comment in the chat about like the infighting around like neo-pronouns. This Oppression Olympics is not just exclusive to like gay and lesbian people. It's also trans people trying to fight for proximity to privilege among ourselves too. Right? There's a common narrative of like pitting binary trans individuals, like trans men and trans women, against non-binary folks. And there are some folks who really kind of embody that, as somebody who is not binary right now in my life, but was at one point in time. The way that I was taught to walk through the world as a binary trans man, and some of the pushback that I did on folks who were saying that, oh, well, I'm feminine and a trans man, and kind of like pushing back against those, was just continue to perpetuate, misogyny and the patriarchy, and that idea of, if I can kind of replicate like white cis man normativity, I will be more accepted by white cis men versus being othered. So right, we also have we also have so much pushback against the people who use they them pronouns, or people who use like z zim pronouns, or like yo 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 or pers, because of how non-normative, and there's air quotes around those for everybody who's going to listen to the podcast, they are. Because again, the further away you feel from normal to others, the less privilege you're inherently going to have, because we're going to have to pause around things like your pronouns. So there are people in the community who are then going to push you away or actively work against you as a way to then lift themselves up more towards privilege. So it's not just like a white cis gay thing.
Yeah.
Trans people do it to ourselves too.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely have people in my community be like, I'm so trans, I don't understand that you're non-binary.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's definitely an issue that we have within the community too.
Like 3 words popped out in my mind with the both of your answers. It's just, you can't win. No matter what you do, you can't win because of the custom. And I think many of us feel that way, like especially with intersectionality of these and the oppression. It's just that, like hearing the trials and tribulations that the both of you have, and also the queer community and trans community have, it's just really like I cannot imagine walking amongst us and just have that feeling of I can't win. Like, I can't have like a piece of myself. I cannot express, or rather you cannot express a piece of yourselves without backlash and without people asking why. And that's really frustrating. And since Cam, you started sharing about some of your experiences walking first as a trans binary man and then non-binary, let's talk about the both of you. So for those who don't really know, Kim and Cam are together, and and so Ryan, give your heart. So would you be comfortable sharing about what is it like walking amongst or walking or living or surviving and thriving in this world where there's so many systems that are put in place to basically go against your very existence. Like, what is it like, and if you can paint a picture of that.
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah. I feel like you should go first.
I was gonna pitch this one to you first. So yeah, it's hard to kind of answer that question really succinctly. Because right, there's a lot of working pieces that come into play when you have to exist as a trans person, specifically in the United States. Right. So for me as a non-binary person, when I first came out as trans, I didn't know non-binary was like a thing one could be, because it just wasn't part of the lexicon at that point in time. So I had to go through like gender therapy, and then I pursued testosterone, and then I pursued top surgery, and then I pursued a hysterectomy. Now I'm still on testosterone. I've got a little bit of facial hair. It's great. Right. So there is privilege in being able to pursue all of those things. I was in grad school at the time. University of Michigan has a like gender clinic. So I got my therapy for free. I didn't have insurance, but the school was able to assist me with things like testosterone. So it was cheaper. Don't tell the Department of Education, but I used some of my grad school loan money to be able to get top surgery. But don't tell them that. The Department of Education asked, it never happened.
Betsy DeVos is
yep.
gonna come.
I know she's gonna come for me, right? So there was a lot of financial privilege that I had in being able to pursue those things, which that I think makes like the legal aspects of existing in the US a lot easier for me, right? I was able to pursue a legal name change. Cameron is not the name that my parents gave me at birth. I was able to pursue getting an M gender marker on my driver's license. I was able to pursue getting that on my birth certificate. It's on my passport. So in a very real sense of all of my documentation, I'm very binary. I'm legally male in the United States, even though I don't live my life in any way, shape, or form in that way. So I think from that perspective, like if you were to look at me and Kim on paper, we look like a straight couple, because all of Kim's documentation is all F and all of my documentation is all M, which, you know, in a world where we've had conversations already about potentially marriage equality being repealed, Kim and I had a conversation a couple of like right before the election, where Kim was like, what are we going to do if we decide we wanted to get married and they repealed marriage equality? And I was like, we would just get a straight marriage, because my documentation says this.
I was like, oh, you're right. I was like, I didn't think of it that way.
So right, legally, there's some interesting loopholes around things, but I think when we go out, it's very strained, especially as I'm a non-binary person who is now read as like I'm gonna assume cis white man in society. Because Kim and I experience a lot of really fun things like latent sexism at restaurants, where people will just hand me the check, even though it's Kim's turn to pay.
I'm fine.
Yeah, I'm not. I want you to pay. It's your turn. But right, it even goes so far that like, you know, the server will hand me the check. I'll hand it to Kim. They'll see me hand it to Kim,
and then they'll hand it back.
And then I'll hand it back to me.
They'll see me put down my card, and then upon returning, we'll still give it to Cam. And I was like, "That what? It's my card."
Yeah, I am not Kimberly. Also, you saw them put this on the check thing.
Yeah.
Right. So we get to experience the joys of like sexism within a heterosexual context, because we track as those. But I think it also makes it interesting to like exist with friends, or exist amongst like folks who maybe are newer in our circles.
Yeah.
Just because I think people then think that we're a straight couple and then don't realize that we're like secret queers, even though we're not secret about it at all.
Yeah. I think what's tough for me is that like, I think because of mine and Cam's specific identities and the way that we present, we get to move through the world with like some amount of privilege, right? But I think what's hard for me is like really honoring my experience and my identity. I find that really difficult to do. So like an example is like, you know, yeah, it's like really, really great when we go out in public and we want to just like, I don't know, slide under the radar, because I mean, Boston is, you know, anyway, I won't go into that.
Or when we go visit my parents in North
you
Carolina.
know, like
right?
it's not, it's to be honest, right? It is kind of nice to just, you know, be able to like somewhat slide under the radar. They might label us as like queer or gay, but they like may not, you know, think that we're trans. So that's kind of helpful, especially when we like go to visit, you know, Cam's parents in North Carolina. But I think what's hard for me is like when I sit at home and I try to like think about, you know, my gender identity and like how I want to be seen in the world, like that is harder to achieve. And so I think for me, the struggle is around like, how do I continue to like honor my identity and myself? And I think that gets harder. And like, I think Cam alluded to this. It's like when we, you know, meet new people, is it like, do I immediately have to come out to them? Do I just like, whatever, like feel them out for like 5 times that we hang out and then eventually be like, wait, actually I use they, them pronouns. Like we're not, you know, a he, she couple, all of that. There's also like, you know, to go more like systemically, I think Cam was talking about just like the ability to like change your name and like change your gender marker. And like, as someone who has more recently come out as trans, something I've been grappling with, like, I'm originally from California and am now living in Massachusetts, obviously. And both are states that are pretty progressive and have like discrimination protections. California specifically has gender marker X. Does Massachusetts have now?
We have it on our driver's license, but not on our birth certificates.
Okay. So, but like a question for me is like, yeah, I think getting a gender marker X would help me, you know, really affirm my own identity. But I have questions on whether or not I would want a police officer to know that I am trans, right? Like your personal identification is something that every person gets to see. And it's like, while I want this really affirming thing and for it to be of record, I kind of worry that if I get pulled over by a cop and they see a gender marker X, I'm suddenly very screwed.
Yeah.
And so I think it's moments like that where I'm like, I don't know how to actually truly honor my experience and live in this way. So I think that's like more of the gripes that I have, not so much that, you know, around like me and Cam's existence, but more about like how to truly be non-binary and feel like I'm affirming my own identity without, you know, putting myself out there for horrible things to happen.
And to kind of riff off of Kim's like mention of the gender marker X, which is a really great like third gender marker. So we have a former roommate who's actually also trans and also non-binary, and they're trans feminine. And they're from New York City. So New York City is the only place in New York that you can actually get your birth certificate and your driver's license changed to an X. So our former housemate was like, I'm going to do this because I still have a New York driver's license. And I think they actually did it.
Yeah.
But when they did it, like, I was like, I would panic because when I lived in Wisconsin, I got pulled over by an officer at like 6 p.m. for forgetting to turn my headlights on, even though it wasn't dark. And when I gave him my license that had an M on it, it was still from North Carolina at that point in time because I had just like moved to Wisconsin after finishing grad school and hadn't changed any documentation. But it had an M on it. And when he went and ran all of my stuff, he came back and he's like, oh, so that's how they do it in North Carolina, huh? And he was very clearly like thrown off by the M because when he took my ID, he was calling me ma'am. And then when he came back, he was really aggressive. And was not gendering me at all, but like really, really aggressive. So I'm always like kind of exactly to Kim's point of, you know, do I want a cop to know that I'm trans? Absolutely not. No, I don't want to talk to a cop ever again. And I'm also a white person, right? There's so much privilege in being able to be like, I don't want to ever talk to a cop. And I can probably avoid that because they're not going to actively harass me. Right? Like that was a terrifying experience on the side of the road at 6 p.m. in Milwaukee as a white trans person. So for me, I would love to also have an X on like my birth certificate and things because the M is better than the F, but also still drastically wrong. But I don't want people to know unless I tell them, right? I don't want certain people to know, right? It's much more safe to be able to pass as a man to a police officer than it is to know that if something happened and I got arrested, that they would immediately throw me into, you know, my own cell as a gender X person, or potentially harass me because of it.
Yeah. And I think this all boils down to the fact that when it comes to like inclusion and acceptance in general, but like, because we're talking about trans folk right now, we'll just like frame it there. I think we're, as a country and as a overall community, we still have a very like surface level understanding on what it means to actually be inclusive and accepting. And I think particularly for like trans folk, right? Like when you hear about trans folk, you're always like, oh, it's, you know, it's these trans people trying to get gender affirming care. It's about gender markers. And yes, bathrooms, right? And like you hear about these big things, and yes, those are important. But like what we're not actually thinking about doing is like, you know, what is beyond the gender marker? What is beyond the bathroom situation? It's about actual inclusion, and it's about actual acceptance, right? And so like, if you're just gonna go and state like, you know, if you're going to go and pass a state policy where, you know, everyone is allowed to use a bathroom for, you know, for which they're, you know, identify, or, you know, everyone is allowed to change their gender marker, that's great. But if there's not also like the cultural and community change that goes along with it, it means nothing, right? And like, while I am so grateful to be in Massachusetts where there are non-discrimination protections for trans folk, fun fact, I actually worked on that campaign. But, you know, that's great, but like there's still folks getting harassed trying to use the bathroom, trying to use public accommodations. We know that the Trump administration has recently tried to roll back non-discrimination protections like in healthcare. And so like, if you have all of these statutes or ability to, you know, to change your gender markers, but there isn't actually like steps to actually make people feel included and accepted, I think that it's not enough, right? And so like, while I can go and get a gender X on my, you know, driver's license, do I want to? Like, do I still feel safe to do so? Do I feel empowered to do so? Like, no. And so I think that is an issue that we have to deal with, is like, okay, you can pass all these laws, but you also need to make sure that there is like true like culture change.
Yeah, I look at discrimination in the workplace a lot, and I see the same, or not same, but rather similar pattern where things are still very performative, and they want to pass things that show that they acknowledge people, but does not think of the, again, like the system and the big picture as a whole, you know, how to include people. And it's not just about passing policies that show inclusion. It's not like a showmanship issue. It's more of like thinking about, all right, so we pass this policy, what are the other things that we do to, like Kim said, empower these folks to take on their policy, which is a great segue to talking about the elections, which you all have mentioned. So presidential election aside, that's again another episode altogether. We have a lot of queer folks who ran and got seats in the different like Congress and Senate. Like for example, we have Sarah McBride, who is the highest, in a sense, highest ranking trans person, and then we have also Maury Turner, who is I think the first non-binary Muslim politician. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. What are your thoughts? Do you think it's performative? Do you think it's gonna be effective? What are your opinions and stance on what has happened so far?
Okay, organizer, go.
Man, I don't really have like a great take on this. I mean, I think it's great. I think representation and visibility is great. And I am so happy that these folks are getting recognized and that, you know, we're getting that representation. Very similarly to my last answer, though, I think that visibility and representation is just one step in like true inclusion and liberation. And so like, I would caution us to just not like, as a community, to not just like sit on our laurels and be like, okay, like Sarah McBride won this really great election. You know, we've had Danica Rome in Virginia. Like we have trans legislators, and visibility is important. But like, to draw this to like race, right? Like we've had Black representatives and state electeds for a while now. I mean, not as long as we've had white people, but like, you know, but that doesn't mean that the Black community is still being treated equitably in this country, right? And so I would draw parallels to say, this is a great win. We should continue to do it. Obviously, our message is getting out there, but it's not enough, right? Because just because you are the exception to the rule, right? I'm happy that we have the exceptions to the rule. Maybe before we didn't have trans legislators. Wow, I can't speak today. But again, like in order to make sure that, people are having the best life outcomes, we can't just stop there.
Yeah. Right. I think there's also this thing, right? We are so far removed from our legislators sometimes, right? Like, I know Ayanna Pressley represents me in Massachusetts, or actually did last time around. She actually doesn't anymore because Kim and I moved. But right, like, have I ever met Ayanna Pressley in person? No. I know you have. Yeah. Okay, flex, fine. Right, but if you think about like the people who need it most, kind of as Kim and I mentioned, like we started off this podcast talking about Black trans women. We know that a lot of Black trans women are experiencing things like homelessness because a lot of homeless shelters don't allow trans people in. So they're experiencing like really like deep homelessness and that they can't even get a shelter bed for the night. We know that a lot of trans folks, specifically again, Black trans women, are experiencing higher rates of unemployment, which is also compounded by the pandemic currently happening. We know, as Kim mentioned, Donald Trump's administration tried to roll back healthcare for trans folks. So it was a 1557, which essentially said that as a trans person, somebody has to be able to serve me when I go into a hospital or try to get healthcare. They can't deny me based on my transness, and that got repealed. So again, we kind of have these compounding oppressions where we also then know that, okay, if we're talking about Black trans women, we know that trans people experience a lot of voter suppression because if you don't look like the gender on your ID, oh, well, your ID is fake. Or if you've changed your name and you didn't update the voter roll, oh, you can't vote. Here's a provisional ballot instead if you're lucky. And we also know that Black people also experience outrageous amounts of voter suppression. So while it's really great to have that representation in the legislature and be able to have those people who are starting to advocate on a large scale policy level for constituents who identify in similar ways that they are, we also know that, again, right, there's a good chance that people like me are going to get benefits from having, a trans person in my state's Senate or my state's House of Representatives versus a Black trans woman who is struggling much more than I am because of the compounding oppressions that she's experiencing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I remember, okay, first, the election season this year was heavy. And so when the news came out about all these political figures essentially making history, people were celebrating, at the same time. It was a question of, like you mentioned, hang on, we have had Black politicians for a while, and yet they're still being suppressed, they're still being oppressed in many different ways, and in ways that hasn't changed ever since the formation of the United States. And so that was an interesting insight from the both of you. And I also want to give a shout out to a lot of the grassroots organizations and grassroots movements that have essentially led us to where we are right now, with when you mentioned voter suppression, it reminds me of Georgia. Where oh my god, I feel so bad, I forgot her name, where Stacey Abrams, she, because of what happened to her in her race, she her race to get the seat, she registered like I think 600,000 voters, 800,000 voters, and I think it all happens on the ground essentially, and I think we are seeing more and more of that, not just with the Black Lives Matter movement, but also like I've heard of queering the census. People are in that way trying to be in the system to beat the system, which also is a question from me to the both of you. So what are your thoughts about being in the system to try to change and beat the system? Do you think that works? Do you think it's something that's too visionary in a way that's not practical? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. You have your email up. So I mean, I think, you know, personally, I think what we desperately need in this country is democracy reform.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's great that, I mean, it's awesome that Stacey Abrams was able to build this like grassroots, like voter registration, like, you know, and to fight voter disenfranchisement in Georgia, but that's hard. And like, what we need to really think about is that, like, you know, a lot of these systems have been held hostage for so long, and that there is so much power hoarding that for us to see true effective change, we do need some form of democracy reform. So like, I think going back to what I said around, you know, having trans legislators, like that's great and like wonderful, but they are, you know, still stuck in this system that is holding all of us hostage. So what we need to strive for is democracy reform. Now, in terms of like your question of, you know, how we do that, I think it's a yes. I think it's a complicated question. I think we need to have, as a community, as a progressive like movement, need to have like a really clear long-term vision, but also like we have to work for incremental change. And I think what is like tough about, like, my hot take is what I think what's tough about the progressive movement is that we have people that are either in either camps. We have people that are like, burn it all down. We only have to have a long-term vision. Like, we can't be in the system because the system is inherently bad. We have those people. Then we have the people that are like, no, we need to be pragmatic. Incremental change is how we get there. And I think what we actually need is both. We need to come together and be like, hey, this is our long-term vision for the future. And like, yes, we want to get it in this, and this way, but let's also work to like create and generate the small wins that's going to help people today, right? So that doesn't mean that we're going to like abandon all hope for, you know, the 2020 election or like the midterm elections or whatever, but that we're going to do both. So like, you know, taking wins where we can, like in Georgia, while also like maybe visioning for a future where, you know, we don't have an electoral college or that the Supreme Court looks different. Like, I think it's a mixture of both. What do you think?
I think you said it better than I would have. I don't have anything to add to that one.
See, Kim, you're a professional too.
A lot of organization, so they know better than I do.
So before we go on to kind of close up the session, does anyone here have any questions? I'm also gonna hop onto Facebook to see if there's any question. Christopher Adam Cousin say, class of 2011, what's up? Hi, what's up? So yeah, does anyone here have any questions or any sharing that you want to share to our guest speakers?
I want to say hi, Cam. I haven't seen you in a long time.
I saw you on Poe's Instagram recently. Nice haircut.
Thank you.
All right, so if there's no questions, no other sharings, we'll, I guess, kind of end with one or two questions. So the first question would be, so what is the both of your vision for the future?
Oh boy. Cameron, you can go first.
I mean, I think kind of one of the things that we've talked about pretty consistently through this is a vision for the future that incorporates those amongst us who are the most marginalized and who experience multiple compounding oppressions. And trying to achieve that through a combination of, as Kim just kind of said, through little wins that are really tangible, that impact people's daily lives, but also trying to do some systemic reform, whether that's reforming the queer community to make it more trans friendly, or working to redistribute power rather than balance power, which is one of Kim's favorite things to talk about within the queer community. So that way we're not focusing right on gay, white, cis people. And I say gay is kind of including lesbians in that too. But that we're actually focusing on those within the community who might need additional supports to be able to get things like housing, right? In the US, we've always kind of really passed policy or celebrated things that benefit those who already have means, right? The first thing that we did, as we mentioned a while ago, was go for marriage equality instead of things like job discrimination or housing discrimination or discrimination within homeless shelters. So I think for me, I'm hopeful that a future incorporates things where maybe we see some of those trans folks who are now in those big positions of power in the legislature actively working to help protect other folks, and that we see allies who are either queer folk who are allies or who are cis straight folk who are allies, being able to support some of that so that we have better overall like life outcomes for folks. I think that's kind of my hope of the future, is we stop having to be afraid to like exist and be around, which you would think is not like a huge ask, but it turns out it really is.
Yeah, I mean, I would say similarly. I think my hope for the future is very similar. I would say that my hope for the next like year would be that, like, you know, with like renewed conversations about racial justice and social justice and all of that, that like we, particularly as a progressive community, are one, pushing the Biden administration and all of our newly elected like people to adopt the most progressive agenda possible, right? So like not getting complacent because we've made some wins. And then two, like I've said throughout this entire like interview, that we actually do racial justice, queer justice in a way that is truly inclusive, and that's not just surface level and performative. And so like, you know, I'm done seeing, well, not I'm done, but like, I don't want you to just stop at putting your pronouns in your email if you're not able to understand why that's a best practice, right? You know, an example is that I started working at my company, I came in, everyone had their pronouns in their email and they misgendered me, and they still do. I've been there for a year and a half. It's like, what's the point of, you know, having this best practice when you don't know why it's so important, when you don't, you know, when you don't honor that? And so I think, you know, that's like a very specific example, but overall, I think in terms of like policy and politics, like we really need to figure out how to do things in a race forward way. So like, don't just, you know, promote policies and then be like, oh yeah, and this also affects people of color and queer people because they just happen to be poorer, right? Like do it in a way where you're centering those folks first. And then like, you know, this is kind of pie in the sky because I feel like people just can't do this, but like, you know, folks that are most marginalized should be in positions where they are developing the strategies and the solutions. So like you need to be investing in marginalized communities, you need to be investing in trans communities to like build up, you know, their opportunities and to be able to give them the space to actually be able to do that. So that's my hope for like the next year. I don't know if that's going to actually happen, but that's, you know, I feel like it should.
Yeah, and I think it's something that people can look at, right? Because it's the next year and people can look at and definitely remember the whole, the next administration accountable. So Ryan has a question. How will you go about educating and advocating for the trans community and the most marginalized people without, quote, watering down the subject matter to be more palatable for the masses? Basically, how to get people to buy into something if they feel like they're so removed from these issues.
Organizer.
Boy. Well, so this is hard. I don't have like a great answer for this. What I do have to say is that it is about building solidarity. Because like, and getting people to understand that to be in solidarity with people, you don't have to fully understand everything, right? Like you don't have to fully understand a trans man's experience, a non-binary person's experience or whatever, to just like love them and want them to have the best life outcomes. And I think that's what we need to base it in. And I think what we've been doing a lot on like campaigns and stuff is like really trying to educate people. But like at the end of the day, like you don't need to have like I mean, is it empathy? Is it sympathy? Anyway, one of those words. You don't need to know what it's like to be able to like think that someone deserves to live their life. And that's what we need to build it on. Now, I don't, I think in terms of race, which is not about trans folk, but like a thing that a lot of people are doing in racial justice is using a race class narrative. And so like there's a lot of organizers that are in like deeply rural white states that are going on doors and talking directly with white voters about race and racism and racist dog whistles, about how they have been using those and like the racial animus to actively divide people so that money and power is concentrated for people at the top. So that's like an example of how they're trying to like build solidarity, be like, hey, you might not understand what it's like to be Black. You might not understand what it's like to be poor and Black, but like you can understand, they're trying to like draw those connections to be like, they're pitting us apart so that, the wealthy few can have all the power. So that's an example of how some people are trying to like build solidarity around race. I think like with trans folk, it's hard. I mean, when I was working on the campaign in Massachusetts, a lot of our messaging wasn't really about like trying to get people to understand the trans experience, but just getting people to understand that trans people are people and they also deserve dignity and respect. So like, yeah, I guess that's my like long, short answer of like, I think it's about building solidarity. The specific messaging, I don't know.
Yeah. I think Yes on 3 was also an interesting campaign too, because essentially part of what y'all did was also remind people that we weren't all going to go into like women's rooms and spy on people. The No on 3's campaign logo was just somebody looking over a bathroom stall. So right, like it is about kind of finding some of that commonality with folks who are like, well, I don't have anything in common with you. So, cool, we can find the commonality of, I don't think people should be harassed in the bathroom. I'm not going to harass anybody in the bathroom. Neither are you. Cool. You should allow me into the bathroom.
Yeah.
Because I promise I'm not going to bother anybody. I'm just here to pee.
Yeah.
But, I think utilizing those narratives where we're able to find some of that common ground is probably one of the best ways to kind of get folks in the door. And then once we get them in the door, then we could say, okay, here are some of the other things that the community is struggling with now that you have a baseline investment. Right, and the queer community has done this for a really long time in our historical organizing perspectives. Right, if you think all the way back to like Harvey Milk, one of his biggest things was like encouraging folks to come out when it was safe, because if somebody knows a real life queer person, their acceptance of queer people and their visions of potentially being an ally and working in solidarity with us increase exponentially. And it doesn't just impact the one queer person who came out to them and their family, it impacts everybody else. Now, it's a lot of responsibility to put onto a person to come out and be like, hey, yo, it's me. Since you know me and you love me, you love everybody else, like don't actively oppress me. And it also doesn't work all the time, because I still have family members who voted for Trump and I'm like, hey, cool, great. So that didn't work on them. But I think trying to use kind of like a multi-pronged strategy of whether it's interacting with people through like shared oppression, saying, hey, I am poor, you are poor. They're trying to pit us together and trying to drive my identity as a trans person in between us. And I'm here to kind of talk through that with you, or coming out and saying, right, we have Trans Day of Visibility in March, which I actually think has done a lot because it's shown the variety and just the beauty and the individuals throughout our community. And I think when like cis people interact with that, they get to see that trans people are everywhere. So they kind of know that, it's not just people who look trans or people who fit a particular box of transness, like agender folks are super valid, non-binary folks are super valid, genderqueer folks are all super valid, gender fluid folks are valid. And they start to conceptualize us as more than just like one or two things that don't impact them, and start to conceptualize us and realize that like they could be interacting with us in all walks of their lives. So thus it does impact them. I also think one of the biggest things is reminding cis folk that they too have gender. Right?
Sorry, I'm like, yeah.
But honestly, no, right?
It's true.
Right, we do it with white people all the time, right? We remind white people that we have race. I think reminding cis people that they have gender then also reminds them that just because my gender is different from yours doesn't mean that we don't share something in common. Just because I live my gender in a different way or I experience my gender in a different way doesn't mean that we don't have something in common, and thus we should work together because we still experience oppressions or anxieties or concerns around our gender, whether you identify as a man or as a woman, or as, you know, a lady or a gentle them, or kind of wherever you are in between, right?
Yeah.
Or off the chart completely.
And one last thing, I know we're like basically at time, but I want to squeeze this in. Allyship is like complicated, right? But like we can't do this on our own. And like I said in the very beginning, you know, trans women of color have always done this activism, right? And it's not that like, you know, it's not that trans women of color need better messaging or whatever. It's the fact that like our own community hasn't built solidarity with these folks. And so like, yeah, we can sit here and talk about strategy all day about how to message, how to find common ground, how to get people through the door. But if like other folks beyond trans folks do not start to like accept and also like buy into this agenda and try to help us along, then I don't want to end this on a non-optimistic note, but then like we're still gonna be stuck, right? Because it's not that like trans organizers haven't been savvy or like haven't had the right like, you know, strategy about this. It's truly about, you know, that solidarity that is lacking. And so like that is a key part of the ingredient list.
Yeah, no, for sure. We definitely need solidarity, right? Trans struggles and trans lives are not just ours only. They're impacted by everybody else around us. So solidarity is super important. And everybody who listens to this podcast should go check out Trans Mass Resistance. If you're around on Sunday, go to the rally and march, either virtually or in person. But trying to find ways to get active, and I think trying to find ways to talk about trans folks and educate yourself is a really good next step for the cis folk who are going to be listening to this in the future, to turn your bummer into a call for action.
Cam makes my hosting so easy because that was what I was gonna say. Thank you both for coming. I want to remind everyone, like Cam mentioned, November 20th is the Trans Day of Remembrance. Remember our friends and folks that we live on this earth previously and have been attacked, and some of them did not survive simply because of their gender identity. And I really sick as a cisgender heterosexual person. I really implore everyone who wants to be an ally, who wants to be an activist, to really think about and even anyone who has opposing views towards gender identity and sexual orientation, to really think about what harm does it do to you to just stand in solidarity with someone who is different from you. Like what Kim said, we don't have to be literally in their shoes to imagine what it's like to be in their shoes. So what's the harm for us as cisgender and heterosexual people to stand by their side and say that we're with you, and what can we do and how can we organize for our peers in our community. So with that, we'll call this episode we'll call an end to this episode. And again, really thank you, Cam and Kim, and also folks who are here today with us, and also to all of you listening in. Once again, this is What's Going On by Suffolk University Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Cindy. Thanks.
Bye.